which means that the geoglyphs are devices for people to determine certain calendar dates.
The Nazca lines were supposed to be finished ground, mapped since 1927, flown over almost daily, a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1994. It took researchers close to 100 years to count 430 figures out there. So how did a computer, working from aerial photos of desert that people had already walked across, turn up 303 figures nobody had ever recorded in 6 months? And why is the biggest of them small enough to stand beside? Start with one figure, because that one figure is what makes the rest of this hard to shrug off. Out on the Nazca Pampa, about 50 kilometers inland from Peru's southern coast, there is a killer whale cut into the desert floor. It runs roughly 22 meters long, about 72 feet, and it is holding a knife. It sits within sight of an old footpath. Nobody had ever recorded it. Not the pilots who have photographed that ground since the 1920s, and not the survey crews who have walked it for decades. A computer marked a spot on a map, a field team hiked out to check, and the whale was lying there in the open, the way it had been lying there for around 2,000 years. If you had asked anyone working that desert in 2020 what was left to find, they would have told you the map was close to done. Almost a century of aerial photography, satellite passes, laser scans flown from aircraft, teams from Japan and Peru walking transects in the heat year after year. They had no idea what was still sitting under the lens. Here is the count they were working from, and it is worth holding on to, because everything that follows leans on it. The Nazca figures entered the scientific record in 1927. Aerial photography in the 1940s brought the confirmed total to 112. Starting in 2004, high-resolution satellite imagery sped things up. By 2020, another 318 figurative geoglyphs had been added. Round it off and you get 430 figures, found across roughly one human lifetime of dedicated work. It helps to know what one of these things physically is, because the answer is stranger than the pictures suggest. The Nazca Pampa sits about 500 meters above sea level on a tableland roughly 400 kilometers south of Lima. The surface is covered in dark stones, oxidized by thousands of years of sun into a reddish-brown crust. Underneath that crust, the ground is pale. Make a figure by dragging the dark stones aside, and you expose the light layer, and the line you have made is not carved or painted. It is a difference in color between two layers of dirt. That should have washed away 100 generations ago. It did not, because this is one of the driest places on the planet. It barely rains, and the plateau is unusually still. The wind that does move across it carries warm air that sits over the surface and takes the edge off the gusts, so the figures stayed. 2,000 years of a place doing almost nothing is why anyone gets to argue about them at all. The relief-type figures work slightly differently. Instead of clearing lines, their makers piled and arranged surface stones on slopes and hillsides, which produces a shape you read by shadow and texture rather than by outline. Those are more fragile. They're also the ones nobody could see. Then, in 2022, a team from Yamagata University's Institute of Nazca teamed up with researchers from IBM. They took high-resolution aerial photographs of the whole region. And they did something nobody had tried at that scale. They trained a machine to look for the figures instead. And the training set was almost comically thin. A model of this kind normally learns from tens of thousands of labeled examples. This one had 430 known geoglyphs to learn from, and that was the whole library. Every figure anyone had ever confirmed on the Nazca Pampa, and it still was not enough data by the standards of the field. They ran it anyway. What came back was a map of odds. It covered the whole Nazca region at 5-meter resolution, and it told the researchers where to point their attention. The model ranked its own candidates. Human analysts screened those rankings and threw out the ones that were obviously geology or tire tracks or shadow. Then field crews took the survivors and walked out to them, one coordinate at a time, in one of the driest places on Earth. That last part is the piece that usually gets left out when this story gets told. The field survey took 6 months. The combined work of screening the machine's pics and checking them on the ground came to 2,640 labor hours. Every confirmed figure was recorded with drone imagery. The team published the result on September 23, 2024, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The lead author was Masato Sakai. The headline number was 303 new figurative geoglyphs, plus 42 new geometric ones on top. A century of work had produced 430. 6 months of machine-assisted survey produced 303 more. Yamagata put the change in discovery rate at 16-fold. And the way those 303 were found is more interesting than a straight scorecard, because the machine did not simply hand over 303 correct pins on a map. The published breakdown splits them 3 ways. Some were figures the model predicted individually, the clean hits. Some belonged to a cluster the model had flagged, where the crew went to check one mark and found neighbors the model never called. And some were found by the field team at spots the model never picked at all. Those turned up because people were already standing in the right patch of desert. So the honest version goes like this. A computer told a small number of tired people which few square kilometers of a huge desert were worth their boots. The people did the rest. The model did the narrowing, and the field teams did the confirming, and the published total depends on both. Forget the speed for a second. What the machine kept finding is the part that matters, because the new figures did not look like the famous ones. Not in size, not in subject, not in where they sat. 5 years before any of this, there was a smaller test that explains why anyone bothered trying it. The Yamagata group has been working this ground since 2004, and they cared enough about it to build an institute in Peru dedicated to the site in 2012. In November of 2019, they announced 143 new geoglyphs on the Nazca Pampa. Cats, camelids, human figures wearing headdresses, and a 2-headed snake that appears to be swallowing 2 people. The finds ranged from about 16 feet across to roughly 330 feet, and the team dated them to somewhere between 100 BC and AD 300. Almost all 143 came from conventional work, field work, and high-resolution 3-dimensional data, the slow way. One did not. In a trial run with IBM Japan between 2018 and 2019, the researchers fed aerial imagery through a deep learning system on an IBM Power System server. They asked it to suggest candidates. The machine came back with more than 500 possible marks. Only a handful of those looked like they might be figures of living things. The team picked one and went to look during the 2019 field season. They found a humanoid figure standing on 2 feet, roughly 5 meters across, in the western part of the Pampa. It was not the size that mattered, it was the location. Sakai told reporters at the time that it sat in an area they had investigated often, and they had not known the geoglyph was there. Trained archaeologists, standing on ground they had already surveyed, walking past a human figure carved into it. One figure. That was the entire yield of the 2019 experiment, and it was enough to justify everything that followed. So when the full survey ran in 2022, nobody was expecting the machine to be clever. They were expecting it to be tireless, and to have no opinion about which patch of gravel looked promising. IBM also put the detection technology into the open. Other projects can now run the same trick on other kinds of imagery, from crop mapping to irrigation, which is a quiet detail with a large tail. The method that found a knife-wielding orca in Peru is now open to anyone with aerial photographs, anyone with a needle and a very large haystack. It is worth pausing on what these figures actually depict, because the catalog is longer than the tourist version. The confirmed geoglyphs at Nazca include humanoids, birds, monkeys, foxes, spiders, lizards, whales, killer whales, fish, felines, and camelids. There are plants, including flowers, seaweed, rhizomes, and trees. And there are tools, which is the category nobody puts on a postcard: a needle, a loom, a pin, a fan, a musical instrument. Somebody drew a loom into the desert at a scale you can only appreciate by walking around it. This is where the story stops being about technology. The Nazca figures split into 2 families, and until this survey, one of those families was badly undercounted. The first family is the one everyone has seen: line-type geoglyphs, the hummingbird, the spider, the monkey. They average around 90 meters in length. They are built from long continuous lines and sharp turns, and 64% of them depict wild animals. Birds, whales, felines, creatures nobody kept in a pen. The second family is the relief type. These are made by clearing and arranging surface stones rather than by drawing long lines. They sit on slopes and hillsides, and they average 9 meters, 1/10 the size of the giants. 9 meters is a living room. It is a figure you could walk up to and stand next to and take in with your own eyes from the ground. And 81.6% of the relief-type figures depict humans or things humans made and kept: human heads, priests, llamas, domesticated animals, objects modified by people, The giant ones show the wild world. The small ones show us. That is two different traditions, doing two different jobs on the same stretch of desert. The reason the small ones stayed hidden for a century is now obvious in hindsight, and it is not that anyone was careless. Relief-type figures are small, they are faint, they are eroding, and they do not announce themselves in an aerial photograph the way a 90-meter hummingbird does. Sakai's team has said it plainly. The purpose of the geoglyphs stayed unknown for so long because researchers lacked basic facts about where the figures were and what types they came in. They were reading the giants because the giants were what they could see. The machine had no such preference. It was trained to find the faint ones, and once there were enough of them on the map, the pattern showed up. Here is what the distribution analysis found, and it is the part of this survey that changed the argument. Relief-type figures are not scattered at random. They cluster within viewing distance of the ancient footpaths that crisscross the Pampa on average 43 meters away. Those trails are the informal kind, worn into the ground by people walking the same route over and over. They wind and tangle into a meshwork with no obvious start and no obvious end. Line-type figures do something different. They sit an average of 34 meters from the formal network of straight lines and trapezoids. That network runs from the Ingenio River Valley toward the Nazca River Valley. Those are the planned ceremonial routes. Two families of figures, two networks, two ways of being seen. The team offers this as a working idea, not a verdict. They read the small relief figures as things built and viewed by one person or a small group, on foot, up close. The giant line figures were built and used at the community level for ritual activity. Sakai has described the large ones as working like huge animal-shaped plazas. They sit at the start and end points of pilgrimage routes towards sacred sites. One of those sites is Kawachi, the ceremonial center that looks out over part of the Pampa, which reframes the whole site. There is a reason this site has stayed an argument for 100 years. For most of the last century, the puzzle of Nazca was posed as a question about the sky. Who were the giant figures for, if nobody could see them from the ground? Every theory in the field had to answer that. Researchers have sorted the serious ideas into 5 families. The authors list them as calendar and astronomy, geometry, farming and water, movement, and art. None of them is settled. The debate is 100 years old and still running. But the new figures do not need the sky at all. They were made at eye level, beside walking routes, at a size a person could take in while standing next to them. Which raises a question the old count could not even ask. If you were walking those paths in order, what were you looking at? The team went back to that question in 2025, and the answer they came back with is stranger than the count. On July 28, 2025, at the Peru Pavilion of the Osaka Expo, Sakai announced a second wave. Field surveys run through 2023 and 2024, again supported by the AI system, had turned up 248 more geoglyphs on the Nazca Plateau. Of those, 160 were figurative. Add them to the ledger, and the total number of known figurative geoglyphs reached 893. 430, found across roughly a century. 893, as of the summer of 2025. And 781 of those figures were identified with AI assistance. Read that number again. More than 8 in 10 of the figures on record at that site now come from one partnership, an archaeology institute in northern Japan and a machine learning team. The other 88 from that wave were geometric, lines, trapezoids, shapes without a creature in them. Add those to the 42 geometric figures logged in the earlier survey, and the formal network is still growing too. That matters. The formal network is the thing the giant animals are tied to. The 2025 announcement carried one more finding, though, and it is the part that still does not quite make sense. The team says the new figures appear to be arranged along the small paths by theme. One path runs figures connected to human sacrifice. Another runs birds of prey. Another runs domesticated animals, the llamas and the camelids. The motifs on a given trail hang together, and they hang together in sequence, so that a person walking that trail encounters them in an order. Sakai's own framing at the expo was that the geoglyphs are not independent artworks. Through their combinations and their arrangement, he said, they seem to work as media for carrying the faith and the memories of that time. Elsewhere, he has put it more plainly. Walking the paths means seeing a run of figures, as if they were carrying a message, and each path seems to have had its own meaning. It is worth making that concrete, because it sounds abstract until you picture the walk. You are on foot, on a trail worn into gravel by everyone who came before you. It wins, and it does not go anywhere in particular. and it does not need to. 43 meters off your shoulder, on a low slope, there is a figure of a llama, arranged in stones, about the size of a small room. Keep walking, and there is another one. Then a human figure, then another animal. Every figure on this particular trail belongs to the same subject, and they arrive in an order somebody chose. The trophy head motif is the one that anchors the sacrifice reading, and it does not come out of nowhere. That same motif shows up on Nazca pottery, tied directly to ritual practice. So when a figure holding a head appears carved into a hillside beside a footpath, the researchers are not guessing at the subject from scratch. They are matching a picture in the desert to a picture on a pot from the same culture made by the same hands. Then they are asking why one of them was set where a walker would meet it. Sit with what that would make the Nazca Pampa, a surface you read on foot, one figure at a time, with the root doing the work of a sentence, rather than a gallery or a signal aimed at the sky. And nobody could make that argument before, because nobody had enough of the small figures mapped to see the sequences. We should be careful here, and the researchers are careful. This reading is built on where the figures sit, and on motifs that also show up on Nazca pottery. It is not the last word on a site that has refused last words for 100 years. The trophy head motif, for instance, appears on Nazca pottery in direct connection with sacrifice, which is why the team reads those figures the way it does. Other specialists will test that. That is how this is supposed to go. But the figures are real, they are documented with drone imagery, they are published, and they were not on any map 5 years ago. Which brings us to the number that keeps this from being a finished story. The real question sits in what the survey ran out of time to check. When Yamagata published the 2024 results, they added a note about what was left over. The survey had turned up 968 more candidates that the AI ranked as likely geoglyphs. Nobody has walked out to check a single one of them. Nobody has ruled them out, and nobody has confirmed them. They are sitting on a list, with coordinates, waiting for someone with a permit, a vehicle, and a season. Sakai has said flatly that there are many other geoglyphs in the Pampa that have not yet been investigated. That 893 is a count of figures people have physically stood beside and photographed with a drone. The number actually out there is unknown, and every field season moves it. And the ground those candidates are sitting on is not stable ground. In late May of 2025, Peru's Ministry of Culture approved a change to the protected zone around the Nazca lines. Vice Ministerial Resolution 128 of 2025 cut the reserve from about 5,600 square kilometers to roughly 3,200. That is a cut of 42%. Around 2,400 square kilometers of desert moved out from under the protection map. The government's position was that new studies had marked the areas of real heritage value more exactly. It said the site's World Heritage status was not affected, and the size of the cut was not the part that made people angriest. The reaction was immediate, and it was loud. Mariano Castro is Peru's former vice minister of the environment. He told the Associated Press that the cut removed protection in exactly the places where mining was spreading. He warned of serious risk and of damage that piles up over time. The zones left out of the new map included areas with active or pending mining claims. UNESCO told the same outlet that Peruvian authorities had never notified it of any boundary change. It said it would be asking for more information. The scale of what was being moved off the map is hard to picture, so here is the comparison the Associated Press reached for. The excluded area came to roughly the size of 1,400 soccer fields of ground, losing its protected status at once. Inside Peru's own Ministry of Culture, members filed a formal challenge against the ministry's leader to try to stall the decision. The specific worry was mining. Figures from Peru's Ministry of Energy and Mines show 362 small-scale gold miners working in the Nazca district under a program to make their status legal. All mining in the protected area is officially banned. Cesar Ipenza is an environmental lawyer who has followed the case closely. He has said informal mining keeps spreading there anyway. And somehow, the timing gets worse. Think about what an informal gold operation does to a relief-type geoglyph. These are figures 9 meters across, made of arranged surface stones, readable only because nobody has walked heavily on them in 2,000 years. They do not need dynamite to disappear. One set of truck tracks across the wrong slope wipes out a priest, or a llama, or a figure holding a trophy head. Nothing about the ground afterward tells you anything was ever there. Those hillsides lasted because almost nothing happened on them for 20 centuries. 11 days later, on June 8, 2025, the Culture Ministry reversed itself. It canceled Resolution 128 and put the original boundary back 5,633.47 square kilometers, effective at once. It ordered the site's management plan updated within 10 days. It set up a new body called the Nazca Executing Unit to run the site, and it called a panel of government staff, archaeologists, academics, and UNESCO to work out future zoning. So the boundary held. This time, Ipenza's caution after the reversal is worth repeating because it points at where the pressure actually comes from. He noted that the local authority is the one that has been pushing to shrink the Nazca boundaries, and he expects strong pressure from miners to make that happen. Meanwhile, the team doing the finding has its own problem, and it is a boring one, which is exactly why it is dangerous. At the same Expo press conference where he announced the 248 new figures, Sakai raised the state of his institution's funding. Yamagata is a small national university in a rural part of Japan. Its yearly operating grant is being cut by 90 million yen. If that continues, he said, long-term, steady basic research of the kind the Nazca project depends on becomes impossible. That is the shape of it. A machine that can rank 1,000 candidate geoglyphs in a few months, a desert that has never once refused to hand over another one, a protected boundary that got cut nearly in half and restored inside 2 weeks, and a research budget that decides how many of those 968 coordinates ever get visited. The permit the team works under runs from 2022 to 2026, and the ground itself is not small. The figures are spread across a desert region covering close to 1,000 square kilometers, and the protected reserve around them is more than 5 times that. Somewhere in that expanse are 968 marked points, each one a place where a machine looked at a photograph and said, "There is probably a picture here." Some of them will be geology, some of them will be nothing. That is what a probability map means. But the 2024 survey ran that same list and confirmed 303 figures out of the ones it reached, which is not the hit rate of a system that is mostly guessing. Here is what we keep coming back to. For most of a century, the Nazca Pampa was treated as a finished puzzle with a missing key. Every theory about it was really a theory about why the figures were too big to see. Then a model trained on 430 examples pointed at some faint marks on a slope, and the ground turned out to be covered in figures built for exactly the opposite reason. They were small, they sat close to the path, and they were built for one walker at a time. 893 known figures, 968 unchecked coordinates still on the list. The unchecked pile is bigger than the confirmed one. Which of those coordinates holds a priest, or an orca with a knife, or something nobody has a name for yet, gets decided by whoever funds the next field season. If you had to bet, what do you think is still out there on that plateau, and does it change what you think the whole site was for? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. And if you want the other half of this story, the giant figures nobody can explain, and the theories that have been fighting over them since 1927, that one is waiting for you next.